So hello, everyone, welcome. Who here has any exposure to business models at all in any coursework that you've done? Okay, most of you, which is good. I'll try not to be too redundant. Since you have some experience with it, what's the key to building the right business model around an idea? What do you think the key is?
Well, one thing I think is focusing on the three, or maybe like ones that are most relevant to your company. Not that they're all not important, they are, but value proposition is like huge for some companies. So, that's fine.
Good. And you said the three, is that what you said?
I said, yeah, maybe like the most three relevant to your company.
Good. So in the class, I don't know who teaches it, the materials that I give them, but as the coordinator of the class, all the instructors are given a process called triangulation, right? Which is about trying to identify the three most important elements of the 9 blocks of a business model that together form the complete picture of what makes that system work. So if any one of those 3 isn't done correctly or isn't working properly, chances are the system will be broken, right? So I like the idea that you pick the number 3 because the reality is that's true, right? And it doesn't matter what industry you're in or what concept you're part of. I've done the exercise of triangulation countless times with all different types of students at different levels and even working professionals in executive ed programs. And there are a couple of blocks that no matter what industry you're in or what kind of concept you have, always end up at the heart of the model, right? And one of those is understanding value. And value is connected to what other part of a business model?
The customer.
The customer. So for me, for our time together today, I want to say how you start successfully designing a business model for any idea that you might have is first and foremost, you 100% have to start with KYC. What is KYC? It's knowing who your customer is, right? So KYC is the core starting point for any good business model design. If you do not know who your customer is, you will not be able to design a proper business model around them because they are the heart of what you have created, right? The absolute heart of what you have created. So knowing your customer is the first step of the process. Now, in our classes, we teach you a variety of tools and systems that you might be able to use or leverage as part of exploring who your customer is. And I want to take that discussion of the importance of your customer one step further than we do in our core business models class here. Who recognizes this? Anyone? This is the customer side of what we call the value proposition canvas, right? So this says, if I'm a customer or a potential customer for your idea, I want the attention of you thinking through what are the gains around the idea that you have that I could potentially get from using your product or service, and what are the pains that you're thinking to design your product and service to address that you could remove for me, right? So that my life would be easier or better as a result of what you're thinking of creating. In essence, what this canvas says is you're thinking about what job is that customer hiring your product or service to do for them, right? That's essentially transitioning what we usually think of as a product or service into what value the product or service has in the eyes of the customer, right? And this is key because anybody can create a list of features and benefits, but not everyone can successfully transition that into a discussion or to a communication or to a promotion with their customer about why you should choose their service or product over somebody else's, right? So you're competing in a marketplace that no matter where your new idea sits is likely going to be competitive because there's so much that's out there. It's hard to actually invent something that doesn't have a predecessor or an existing competitor already sitting there waiting for you at some level. Even if it's not directly competitive, remember we live in a culture where substitutions and threats and sharing of things is a commonality, right? So you have to be prepared for not just the things that are most like you, but what are the other things that somebody could hire to do the same or a similar thing that your product or service is going to do. Those become just as important for you to understand so that you can speak to why what you have is more valuable to your target customer than those substitutes, right? So this is one of the tools that I recommend using. It really is about thinking through all the different customer segments that you can come up with that might be a potential user of your product or service or a consumer of your idea, whatever that concept might be, and then figuring out how they either have gain potential or pains that can be solved by what you have. And in essence, what you're asking yourself is, what job do they need your product or service to do for them so that they walk away feeling as though they've really received something valuable, a value add in their life, right? This is the whole system of value creation. I have two important questions here, and that's because no matter where you are in your process, always, when you have an idea about creating something from a new venture concept, right? The whole idea of entrepreneurship is about creating things that are either new or different than what are out there today. There are certain things that because you've researched it or because you've read certain articles or because you've had conversations with certain people, you know, but there also are certain things that you are assuming, right? We all come to every problem, every situation, every circumstances with a certain frame of reference that is our own, that biases our viewpoint of the situation that we're looking at. So when it comes to the idea of the pains and the gains, you want in that list as many knowns as possible and as few assumptions as possible by the time you get to the point where you're really going after that customer, which means you can't resolve the notion of who your real customer is inside four walls of a room brainstorming by yourself or with a small group of people. You must get out and talk to the people who match the profile of the person that you think and that you've made these assumptions about, and let them tell you whether or not your assumption is correct. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never met somebody whose idea survived its first contact with a real customer. Never. Once in all of the consultations that I've done, does anyone's idea that they had, that they dreamt up in their head or as part of a team or as part of a class project, ever survive its first contact with a real customer? Because that customer, if it's the right one, always sheds some light on something that you overlooked or that you missed or that you didn't understand because you assumed some things that were not correct. All right? So it's very, very important that you understand that the only way to get to the point where you know as much as possible is to have validated that with the customer. And so I'm going to show you a couple of tools that you may or may not have seen in your exposure to business models in the curriculum here that might help you with that. All right? Any question about this idea of hiring a product or service to do a certain job for you, and that's how you make this leap from it just being a product that has certain features and benefits or a service that has certain features and benefits to an actual valuable thing in the eyes of the customer. And that's where you want to be. All the great successes in our life today in this competitive market landscape can all be tracked to one commonality, and that commonality is that people buy what they connect with emotionally. In fact, it's stated this way often. People don't actually buy what we make. They buy why we do it. So if they understand the value proposition behind the ideas that we're bringing to the marketplace and why it is that we see the value in it through their eyes, they are 10 times more likely to buy into the concept and share the vision and participate in that with us. So they're not actually buying what it is we're making. They're buying the vision and the emotional attachment behind the value that they see in it that we have taken the time to explore and understand before we present the idea to them, right? Because if you present the idea too early, then you're going to get negative reaction from some of those people because, as I said, you're never going to survive the first point of contact without finding something valuable in that process, all right? Any question? All right. One of the tools that I recommend, so one of the things that's tough about this is getting a routine down that gives you consistency in your feedback so that you can look at these different possible customer profiles that you come up with and somehow have comparative variables that are what I call apples to apples, right? And so who's seen the empathy map before? This should have been seen in many of our core classes, but the idea here is anytime you want to emotionally connect with someone, design thinking and design principle teaches us that the best way to do that is to try to walk in their shoes. Try to empathize with them and see what they see, feel what they feel. You can make certain assumptions about people, but you should always go out and try to validate those assumptions by actually talking with and observing those people in the situations that you need them to be in that would mimic the circumstances of when they would use or be attracted to your product. And if you use a simple tool like this, which I'm a big fan of, then what it does is it forces you to think through 4 key things as that person. So as you're watching this person or talking to this person, what notes can you make about how they're thinking and feeling? What cues are they giving you about the thoughts and the feelings that they're having at this point, right? What are they seeing? What is around them? What are the visual things that are happening that could be distracting them if this is an important point of contact for you and your product or your service to succeed? Know the distractions, know what they're seeing, know the things that they're seeing through a positive lens and the things that they're seeing through a negative lens, right? I call it, think about walking into that bathroom, that public restroom, right? And the feeling that you get just by the cues that you see visually about your comfort level in that public restroom, right? We've all been there where you walk in and you're like, I don't really need to go to the bathroom that bad, right? You've had that moment where you actually, from your eyes, saw something that was negative enough that you did not even want to move further in your process, despite the fact that you did have a need, right? Our customers have that same choice every time they choose to engage with something that's supposed to be emotionally gratifying for them, right? And so if you've not taken the time to step back and think about all of these cues, then you've not done a full understanding or completed a full understanding. What are they actually saying and doing? So are there verbal cues that they can give you that will help you? This is something that I've used for years in my consulting practice when I sit with somebody who's testing technology for me and I want to hear how they feel and what they're thinking and see what they're doing. A lot of the best cues I get, not from watching them interact with the interface as a user, but from what they say, by asking them to comment out loud as they're making decisions, as they're clicking, as they're doing things. I'm able to get a lot of cues verbally from them, the same way I can get a lot of cues by watching and monitoring what's happening on the actual screen, which is what I'm technically testing from a technology perspective, right? So don't ignore your verbal cues. And then lastly, what are they hearing? We as a population are enormously influenced by things we hear around us. And so if you are at points of sale or critical points of contact or whatever your concept is, observing possible consumers, one of the key things you can know is what are they hearing? Who's in their ear and what is it that they're hearing from those people that could be influencing their receptivity to what it is that you are offering, right? So if you take all of these things and consider them together, you are doing your best job, I believe, at comprehensively understanding the emotional mindset of the person that you're trying to serve, right? It's how are they thinking and feeling, what are they seeing, what are they hearing, and what are they saying and doing. If you take all that information and consistently collect it, then you have like experiences to now look at data and try to summarize it. And I suggest taking one of the canvases that has what you consider to be a lot of great information on it from your research and your experience and building out these 2 bottom blocks based on your totality, the summary of the experiences that you have. Because at the end of the day, you'll notice one side is about gains and one side is about pains. And what it's essentially doing is lining back up with this canvas, right? It's helping you through the eyes of the consumer to think about what gains does the person potentially have if they choose to use my product or service that they could get out of it? And what pains are they experiencing that I can see that what I've come up with actually addresses in a meaningful, positive way? The combination of two of those things can help you to design exactly how to present the value of what it is that you have to offer for that particular customer or potential customer, right? And so at the end of the day, this is a huge tool. 4 blocks up top around the face, get that for everyone. If you make any notes about particular gains or pains, sure, drop them there. But I think these foundational blocks are best used as a summary of what you see in terms of commonality and the experience of all the users. All right, so now you've got 2 ways to use 2 different tools to help you with this idea of KYC. Know your customer. Every great business model is first designed through how well you know the customer that it is that you're relying on to make the business successful, right? At the end of the day, without these people, you don't have a business. What do you have? You have a great idea, or maybe a mediocre idea after you think about it, right? But you have an idea, right? And you have to use these tools to find someone who sees the value in it before you even know how to begin to start to build a business around it. I can't tell you the number of times that somebody firmly left the building with an idea of who their customer was, and in that first interaction realized they had a completely different customer than they ever knew existed, and no knowledge of what to do with that base or what was happening with that base whatsoever. So in step 1, it was an immediate pivot to, I'm not going to waste any more time doing any of the other observations I have with this group, because I now understand that this customer is probably going to be way more successful for me than the one I started out with, right? So the second you get out there and start putting your concept in front of people is the second at which you get these glaring aha moments. As long as you sit on them in a think tank, or with your group or your crew or your class or whatever your team is, you're going to get nowhere. Because it's the same people with the same perspective looking at everything that you do and everything that you change throughout the project. It's only once you actually start to try to engage the people that you believe are the customer that you really start to develop what I call impactful insight, right? Not just learning about the consumer, you're figuring out insights that will actually impact the way you build the model around that consumer. Because every customer wants to be related to in different ways, wants to be communicated to in different ways, has different wants and needs. And so everything about the design of the rest of the business model hinges on your understanding of the customer. Know your customer, all right? There are a lot of customer types out there, and in fact, in academic texts, I often see something like this portrayed, where you have this sort of global group that's considered like end users of a product or service. And those are ultimately important to any business model. But a layer above them is actually what we call the influencers, which means who are the people out there who might be a subset of this end user group, but because of their role or their title or their position in a company, for example, in a business-to-business model where the service you're trying to sell is to another business, right? What somehow makes them a greater influencer than just an end user, right? In the world we live in today, what can you envision a very powerful position of influence being in any consumer-oriented product category? How could you be an influencer? Traditionally, from a marketing perspective, and that's my background, we always talked about influencers, and influencers were ultimately celebrities, people who endorsed our products, who had some kind of stature in the community. We don't look at influencers that way anymore. Who are the influencers that we often look to now?
The common persona, like anyone who's out there like with friends and like has a direct connection with the client.
So a direct connection to that person that you've identified is a big one, right? This is where car companies started buying or selling their cars to ad agencies with wrap capabilities on them, right? Where you see somebody driving around in a car and every month the car is wrapped in a different design for a different product. Because people realize, wait a minute, the best way to get a message in front of those 22-year-olds about my Red Bull, which is somebody who used this quite famously as they were launching their product, right? The Red Bull cars that eventually became big giant Red Bull cans on top of blue little Mini Coopers or whatever. You know what I'm talking about? You've seen these, right? What they said was, there's no better way than to interview a bunch of people who represent the customer we want our message in front of and say to them, you know what, we like you so much, drive this car, put your friends in it, drive it around, and the bill is on us. Don't worry about the insurance, don't worry about the payment. For years, there were advertising companies out there paying for people to drive around in vehicles where the only thing you had to be was the person who was willing to drive around in a car that's wrap changed all the time, right? And you got to drive for free because you were considered an influencer and you were a direct connection to the audience member that the people wanted. No more of this indirect, well, I think they read that magazine, but maybe not, or I feel like the demographic trend skews in the Nielsen ratings for them on that television program. No, it was everyone is at that festival and you're going to pull up in this car at that music festival and you're going to show this off to everyone that you can, right? That was a direct connection, and so it changed the face of what influencer looks like in the marketplace. Now we've even gone beyond that. Where do most people get their influence today? Online. So it's following the right person on Instagram, figuring out who the right blogger is that has the right audience following them. If you can sell them on what your idea is, then you just sold sometimes hundreds of thousands of people on what your value is, right? So the idea of how to tap into the influencer market cannot be ignored in terms of thinking about the different customer types that are out there. I say this all the time because I've taught for 2 decades now a lot of classes about business. And the thing that bothers me about the way we teach business in a traditional context is that we talk about businesses that are already established. We go after the people that have the largest market size, that show the largest market potential, where there's the most customers. Well, guess what? When you're brand new and no one knows the first thing about who you are or what you have, that's the worst path to success that you could ever choose, is trying to get massive groups of people interested in what you have. The way you become relevant to massive groups of people is by carefully mapping out all the possible subsegments of customers that could be deeply engaged with you at some level, so that you start with the one that's the most likely to love everything about what you have and your value first. And then you build to the next group, and to the next group, and the next group. And all along the way, what are you building? You're building advocates who are as excited about what you're building and creating as a new business or a new opportunity as you yourself are. Because if you've done your work right, you know those people were the most important people to get first because they were the most likely to have a positive reaction to what it is you had to offer, right? So this hierarchy is here to represent the idea that there are personas, archetypes, some people call them, that you need to develop around who should be your customer. And it should be variable. And if it is variable, what that means is you probably have a concept that could be far-reaching and have wide appeal on your hands, as opposed to a very niche concept where you try really hard to come up with as many customer types as you can, and you really only keep coming back to these 2 or 3. That probably means that your success will be limited to niche marketing. Is there anything wrong with that? No. There's plenty of people out there who are serving niche markets quite successfully, right? But you get some idea about the magnitude of the idea that you have and its potential by developing personas or archetypes for all the different customers that you can envision using your product. And then you go into detail about how they would use your product and how they would see value in it, so that you can find the places where some of those subgroups are similar and different from a value perspective, right? That's what's going to help you build a business. So you need to understand the customer first, and the very specific nature of your understanding of those customers is what will drive your success building something new, right? I say to people all the time, there's all different kinds of people who are interested in products and services for all different reasons, right? All different types of people interested in products and services for all different reasons. I just had a conversation with students in my brand class this week, my brand management class. The reason we're having that conversation is because they've chosen Netflix as a company to do a brand audit for this semester. And these are all students in my class, they're of similar age, and they grew up with Netflix as what kind of service? What does Netflix mean in the world around us today?
Subscription, video streaming.
It's a subscription video streaming service. That's not how they started. What was Netflix originally?
They used to just, I think they started just by mailing DVDs or
DVD by mail service, because times changed. Well, guess what? I'm an older person. Guess how I know Netflix? DVD by mail. What never occurred to the students in my class was that unlike them, who they do still offer DVD by mail, by the way, which a lot of people don't even know. And the reason I'm telling this story is for you to understand value, right, and to the customer. I'll tell you why I subscribe to DVD by mail, right? There are plenty of people. One, I started that way. They actually had to convince me to become a streaming customer because I was a DVD by mail customer because that's what we did back when I found out about Netflix, being an older generation, right? Once they started the streaming service, they gave people free trials. I hated it. Why do you think I hated it?
You weren't the right customer segment for the streaming service.
I wasn't the right customer segment because I liked the fact that I could get very, very quickly very current content delivered to me on a DVD in the mail, and their streaming service, when it launched, largely consisted of some really old crap that I'd already seen because I've been a film buff since I was a child. So unless I felt like rewatching it, I didn't see the value in it. So when do you think I started subscribing to the streaming service?
Once they discontinued the, because I don't think they have that anymore either.
Oh, they do.
2 years ago. When they started making Netflix like shows.
When they started creating original content. It's the same way the same reason I'm willing to pay an exorbitant amount of money for HBO and Showtime and Starz and Cinemax or whatever you want to call it, my cable bill, not because I watch the movies that are on there, because that part of my demand for that service is covered by other things that I do, right? Like going to the movies. But I can't see first run at the time it's released HBO original series content unless I have that HBO subscription. And so the same thing happened to me with Netflix. Once they started creating original content, I started reading articles about it, hearing buzzes about it. I was like, let me give this a try again. Well, they hooked me. The first 2 shows I watched were House of Cards and Orange is the New Black, and I couldn't stop. And then I got hooked on the re-release of Arrested Development, and then it built from there, right? And now I'm a Stranger Things fanatic, and then I'm you name it, I'm gonna get hooked on it now because they've got me, right? But important to this value story and who I am as a customer is, I never gave up my DVD subscription, which I started with. I only downgraded it as it became less relevant to my life to be the $5 service. And I want you to know why. Because when you hear DVD service or DVD subscription service, you're thinking that I probably am outdated with my use of technology and that's probably just something I'm not comfortable with, streaming, and so no. I honestly could care less about the 2 DVDs a month that come with my subscription. I still get them and I watch them and they keep my queue handy. But the real reason I do it is because the DVD subscription service comes with a queue that you can load with releases of movies that aren't even out in the regular theater. Which means that how I use the service is I log on to my Netflix account when I'm sitting watching TV and they do an ad promo or a trailer for a new movie that's about to start this Friday at the theater. I log into Netflix, I hit DVD, I hit the search button, I type in the name of that coming attraction movie. It says, do you want to save this to your future queue? I say yes. I'll never miss that movie. Because I'll either go see it at the theater, I'll come back and rate it, which I love for my streaming service. Because when I'm bored and there's nothing in my queue I feel like watching, I go to their recommendations. Because I rate everything, which means they're pretty good all these years later at telling me what I'm going to like versus what I'm not going to like. So I know what threshold to look for. When I go in and rate it, I do one of 2 things. I either rate it and it goes away because I watched it on the DVD that arrived at my door, Or I rate it because I just went and saw it at the movies this weekend, and I remove it from queue right after I rate it. I've seen it either way. It's done, it's part of my process, right? It is, for me, a management tool to make sure that I never miss any movies that I want to see, right? The value proposition to me is very unique. Did any of you know that customer existed at Netflix before I gave this talk? Do you see how, for some people, that would be extremely valuable? You're a busy person, you're into films, you don't necessarily get to the movies as often as you want. Isn't the idea that you could say as a value proposition to me, look, you can use this part of our service and you'll never miss a movie ever that you want to see, because you'll either go see it and be able to rate it and remember how well you enjoyed it, or it'll just show up at your door one day when it comes to the next video in your queue, because that's what happens as you watch a DVD. It goes out of your queue, the next one comes up, right? And so it just constantly arrives. What I want you to understand is you may never have made that assumption of that archetype or that persona that clearly exists. Not only does it exist, but I will advocate for them. Do you know how many people I've told about this that now has told me I signed up for Netflix DVD because it's managing my movie likes now? So there are other people out there who also would like a service to do this. They just didn't realize that it was already there, right? So your job as somebody who's creating something that you want to be valued is to match the story of what's valuable about what you have to the customer profile that fits who needs that value. And there are hundreds, possibly thousands, for different ideas, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody have questions? It's way too much information about my Netflix viewing habits. I apologize for that. What you're in search of then is to prioritize that list that could be hundreds or thousands of customers deep. Maybe it's only 5 customers deep, maybe it's 10, but I don't want you to get scared if you keep doing it and it just keeps growing as you think about all the nuances of how what you have could have value to people, right? What you're looking for is what I teach in entrepreneurship classes here in the minor is your early evangelist, right? It's the combination of an early adopter with the old concept of what it means to be an evangelist in a community, which is to spread the word, right? And so the early evangelist may not be your mainstream customer. They're a visionary. There only needs to be 50 of them sometimes to reach 5 million, right? That's literally true. They're going to be willing to provide you invaluable feedback if you find them and put your concept in front of them, because that's what they do. They want to share their vision and they're passionate about the things that they have in their life, so they're going to be there on your behalf. Even more important for a lot of people who are starting, these are the people that are willing to pay even before it's been tried and true. They're the beta version customers that you need, right? They're the ones who bought plasma televisions for $10,000 when they came out, even though the marketing message was, this probably, it's new technology and it's probably not going to last you more than 5 years. They sold hundreds of thousands of plasma TVs for $10,000, which, by the way, now cost you like $800, right? 10 years later. So half that time period, if you look at the depreciation of the economies of scale and price, you can see those people really wanted it, right? That's the early evangelist that you're looking for your concept, because they exist for every market, right? The early evangelist is willing to pay and they're willing to do things that somebody else would not, right? The early evangelist in the car industry takes the first-year model of a new car that they love, if they're crazy passionate about cars, even though we know that all the data says chances are first year of a model of any car by any maker is going to be what? First year model, new release, any car, any maker. What is the chance that you're going to face? It's going to end up in the shop repeatedly. It's not tried and true yet. It's like a beta version. It's like when you sign up to use a website before it's really been launched. What do you expect? to get error messages now and then that your job is to report so that people can fix the glitches before it goes mainstream, right? That's the whole point of being an early evangelist. So we have very specific ways of being able to identify who these people are in specific contexts. What we don't do a good job of as entrepreneurs is saying, they're the people I need first. And if I can get them involved and focus all my first round energy on that, then I have 50 people, if that's all it yields, who are multiplied by my efforts out there doing the same thing that I'm doing on my behalf. And by the way, I didn't pay them to do it. They paid me to be a user, right? So now I'm building a revenue model that's helping me pay for going after the next group on my list, right? In entrepreneurship, we call it bootstrap, right? Where you use the funds that you're able to generate from each customer group you go after as your budget for how you go after your next group of consumers. It's the way young companies generally try to hold on to equity for as long as they can before they have to get funding from other people. Because if you've got an idea and a product or a service that's strong enough that you can actually get somebody or find somebody who's willing to pay for it today, then who knows how good it can be, and why are you going to give that up to some stranger just because they happen to have the money to give you on the day you need it, when all you have to do is find the right person who's willing to pay for it and take their money and use it to get to the next level, right? That's the idea behind bootstrapping a startup, and that's really what this focuses on, right? It's a lean startup mentality, all right? Any questions about the early evangelist, this whole customer importance, know your customer, digging deep, finding them? So when you've done that, the good news is we have this tool, and most of you said that you've been through a business models exposure. This is it. This is your 9 building blocks, right? And now you have all the evangelist, the early evangelist info that you need to start filling in that far right block, right? So I know if you took the actual business models course, one of the things I hate most about the book is it says, ooh, it's a mass market product. It's a niche product. No, that's never enough information for a canvas. This should be, it's a him. His name is Ryan. He's 25 to 33 years old. He has a full-time job and goes to grad school at night, and he is the most busy person you'll ever imagine, right? Those are the nuances that make the difference in how somebody on this side uses Netflix versus somebody on this side uses Netflix. That's how you know whether, when you're talking to that customer, if you should be pushing Netflix streaming or if you should be pushing Netflix DVD, which, by the way, is now called DVD.com, a Netflix company, right? It's a seamless link out when you're on Netflix's website. But what they did was decide to disinvest and use that money in their own streaming service and buy the full infrastructure that they needed to continue to grow and deliver that DVD business. Smart, right? That's where the partners block comes in. How do I find somebody who has what I'm looking for to make what I need to happen valuable for the people it needs to? And if I don't need to do it myself, how can I find somebody who's already equipped to do it that I can get to do it with me or for me, right? That's what this whole process is about. This is the process of building the model. Well, you can see that's labeled block number 2. And on the canvas, I always call the value proposition and the customer segments blocks 1 and 2. And they're virtually inseparable, right? Because you can't understand a customer without knowing what's valuable to them, specifically about what you have. And you can't understand what's specifically valuable about what you have without also understanding which customer you're talking about, because there could be so many that are attracted to the idea that you have, right? And so these two are interchangeable, which means to finish the loop of what's important about the building of a business model and the design of a business model is that we have to get to the value. And a business model that you design around any idea you have is only as good as the value that it's able to create for individual segments of the consumers. So your ability to identify those segments and understand the value is exactly how good your business model will be. Because if you don't have those two nailed down, every other thing that you do on this canvas is going to be misguided. Because every one of them ties back to who your customer is. If you got the wrong customer definition, you're not charging the right revenue. If you got the wrong customer definition, you're not reaching them through the right channels. If You got the wrong customer definition. How do you know how to build a relationship with them, right? So all things about your model hinge on these first two blocks. That's the what's in it for me part of the canvas, which is what a value proposition is. It's your customer's chance to be really selfish and say, fine, I see that's a very flashy new thing that you've designed or that you've come up with, but what's in it for me? Because that's the value that I, as an individual customer, need in order for me to be as excited about this idea that you have as you are, right? And so that's the value proposition. For those of you who've seen the canvas, this is the opposite side of the customer canvas that I showed you earlier, which when shown in totality looks like this. You've got the customer on one side, you've got the value of your product or service on this side, and the bridge in the middle is the connection between what gains do they have and how does what I have designed or what I should design for this customer do that gain? How does it accomplish that gain on behalf of my customer? And here's the pains that gives me the chance to say, what can I design or make about my product to make sure that that pain is relieved for that customer? At the end, I'm probably going to know what features and benefits I need to have for that product to do the job the customer needs it to do, that they're going to hire it for, by solving the equation of these things in the middle, which means that for every customer segment, you possibly need a different value proposition, right? That every single user could be unique enough that you have to think deeply about the value proposition of what's in it for me for each and every one of them in order to get from market 1 to market 2 to market 3 in terms of your segments, right? You're building a business from scratch. So what's in it for me, very important. In this one, same thing. Gain creators, pain creators, the difference is that you're talking about what you're trying to design or build. You have a vision for it, but this may be the place that you learn where your vision is a little off thanks to the people that you've engaged, who you saw as your customer telling you, no. What I really struggle with is management of my queue of films, right? It's not that I want to receive an old DVD, but I really want to be able to manage my queue of films better. Well, now you've changed the whole value proposition of what it is that you have to sell in that channel of your business to suit that customer, right? What I want you to remember is value is the user's story. It's never a features list. Anybody can create a features list of what their product does from the product and the designer or the creator's perspective. That is of zero value in this process, unless you're able to translate it into a story for the user that they see the value in, right? So nothing about your value proposition should be about the product or about your design or your view. It should all be written and executed with the perspective of the story of the user in mind, all right? The user story is key here. This is where we get to, just like I told you, there's the early evangelist. From a product perspective, there also is an MVP, all right? And if you haven't heard this terminology, it means products can be a lot of things. And frankly, our own worst enemy as innovators is trying to overdo how much we need to in the version of our product that's going to the market. Because the reality is, you only need to do what those customers in the early evangelist group tell you is required for them to pay. Once you've gotten that far into your development, you should be going to the market. Because if they're willing to pay for it, you've got your first customer. And if you've got your first customer, you've got your first revenue stream. And if you've got your first revenue stream, you've built your first step to successfully extending your product to the next group on your priority list of customer segments, right? This MVP is the minimum viable product, right? In innovation, we teach that the definition is about value creation, right? And so anything that creates value to any group of people is considered an innovation. But implicit in the word value is that it's desirable and that it's also feasible or viable, right? And this MVP portion addresses that viability concern. The customer portion addresses the desirability point, right? So both of the definitions of innovation are embedded in what I'm telling you here. So if you develop a business model using these steps, guess what? You're naturally going to have created an innovation in whatever market space that you're part of. Because you've started with the customer, you've empathized with them, you've created something that's proven itself to be both desirable and viable before you put it out there. You're an innovator. Done, checked. Everything that defines what innovation is, you have now become just by following these first couple of steps that I'm giving you, right? The idea here is sometimes what is required derails you. Because that user that you talk to that represents that early evangelist that you identify is going to ask for something that you simply cannot achieve in the time frame or with the money that you have. Other times, it's going to lead you to some other opportunity. Sometimes, it's just going to underscore or validate what you were already thinking. In any instance, they all are necessary in order to say, I have proof, right? So you want to think about what that means, right? In entrepreneurial terms, it means you're going to be leading either toward execution, pivot, or abandon, right? One of those things is going to need to happen as you go through this process. And as I mentioned before, I've never met somebody who didn't start out with a pivot of some sort. They had to alter their original idea in some way in order to have it match the value of the customers that they actually talked to and identified who met the criteria of an early evangelist. And once you do that, it changes the whole game. That's where success is born, right? So until you get to the point where you've reached a feature or a benefit or an add-on in your product that somebody doesn't require, you now know what the minimum requirement is. And once you get to the point where it's not required, that goes on a future development list, right? Did anybody you know of, especially in the day of technology, create the be-all, end-all service in version 1 of their technology product? Nope. That's where point 1, point 1.1, point 1.2, point 2.0 came from in technology language. They were applying the minimum viable product process to their entire development scheme, right? Which is, you only build enough of the product that is required to get the customer to do that first purchase or that first engagement, and then you work on amassing as much sales and as much success with that product as you can while you use the money from those to fund the next group of customers, the next group of features, and the next version of what it is that you want to release to the world. And once you've put enough in to attract the attention of that second group of customers that you identified, you stop again and start creating your version list. And instead, focus your energy on now expanding your sales and your service to that next group of people. Now your audience is twice the size it was the first time you went through this process, and you just keep going. And guess what? After usually several years, but sometimes in today's fast-paced, technologically driven marketplace, a few weeks or months, you wake up and all of a sudden you're preferred by everyone who's 18 to 24. Look at that. That's the way we teach business now. Your target market is people age 18 to 24. Well, that's totally useless when you're a startup because there's too many of them. And how in the world will I go about reaching them or finding them or talking to them in a way that's meaningful? It's an impossibility. It's an impossible ask. But when you start breaking them down into the smallest segments you can possibly define based on what you know about your understanding of the customer, you can easily build them. Because it doesn't matter how many groups you have to break them out in. At the end of the day, that breaking down is what gives you the ability to build to be that product that all 18 to 24-year-olds want, right? And that's what you have to think of when you're thinking of building a business model versus simply executing some new brand extension or new product line from an existing business that comes with a whole lot of benefits that we take for granted when we're starting something from scratch, all right? So that's the MVP. That's the refined, very narrow view of the product. So you've got the early evangelist, who's the customer, matched to the minimum viable product that they need, and now you're what? You're market ready. Get it out there. However you need to do it, get it out there. Because that means you have, technically, your first customers ready and waiting to receive You just have to have a strategy for how to get as many of them as possible interested, right? And that's where we are here. So now we have the middle block of our canvas understood for that first segment. And now that I can tie those two things together, what can I do? Can I talk to you about the best ways and the best price points and the best ways to gain revenue from this idea now? Yeah, because if my target customer is an 18 to 22-year-old student and also a 40 to 45-year-old working professional, is that possibly two different revenue streams? Can the 40 to 45-year-old working professional possibly afford to pay me a lot more money than the 18 to 22-year-old? They both want it. Isn't what I've told you today about solving how do I get the person who's in that payable range to see enough value in their version of my product that they're willing to give me more money for it than that 18 and 22 was able to give me? Yeah, it all starts to fit together. You can now build out all the other 7 blocks of the model, and you build each one with the same attention to specificity that you built the first 2 with. What are all the ways to think about what's unique and different about that customer segment and how I reach them, or how I build a relationship with them, or which partners would be meaningful to them? All of that stuff has to be looked at with the same eye, the same lens of specificity. And once it is, you start to innovate all over the place. This is why I call Facebook one of the least innovative companies in the history of the world. Facebook's not all that hot among young people now, but there was a time when you could not find a person who wasn't preaching the story of Facebook, right? And that was a time not so long ago, right? What do you think Facebook could have done to better their business model at the point in time when millions and millions and millions of people who are the trendsetters were at their beck and call? They had 100 million users at their height of popularity. Do you think, I don't know, 75 of those 100 million people who were using it would have paid 99 cents a year for a subscription to Facebook in order to access all they had gotten addicted to? You bet they would have. It's under $1 for a whole year. A kid could take that out of their allowance if they were a teenager, right? They left 100 to 75 to $100 million $1 subscriptions on the table because they didn't have the foresight to look at a more creative revenue stream than advertising. Oh my God, look at that. We're taking the world's most technologically sound business offering and we're pairing it with the most antiquated, outdated, and by the way, uncertain and unpredictable model for revenue that has ever existed in the history of man. Right? Why would we do that? It's a horrible business model. It's why it had lackluster performance when it was initiated on the stock market, because people were not sure it could withstand. And lo and behold, what did I open by saying? Facebook's not everything it used to be, is it? Well, can now I start charging people? Well, no, because it passed its heyday. I missed the window to match the value of my offering to the customer that I was serving, right? And if you miss the window, timing is important here. Don't ever forget that. There is opportunity that sometimes exists in a space and time that if you miss it, you're done. That's the truth, right? There also is, timing is important because there is ideas that are way ahead of their cycle. And you have to know how to put them on the revision list and pull them off the shelf when the time is right if you want to capitalize on it. Same way, there is a customer base point you should be trying to reach, and if you reach it, you should pull that handy back of the pocket revenue model out and introduce it while you coast in $100 million of revenue that was unexpected that year, and then watch what happens to your opening stock price. Right? That's about creating and designing a business model for your idea, and it all goes back to your understanding of who your customer is and what value they have, right? People were getting 99 cents a year of value, and for a while after that, and for some of them, I would say it could have been a tiered model. It could have been a 99 cent, a $3.99, and a $5.99, or better yet, they might even have been able to get away with a 99 cent, a $5.99, and a $9.99, right? All that revenue, never recognized, never once recognized. Now it's too late. It's too late. They weren't designing a model that matched the value proposition of the customer they were serving. Right? That's a huge, huge problem. You don't want to be that person. You want to design a model that's solely focused on serving the value of the customer that you identify, right? That is your key. That is your ultimate goal here. If you do this and you just do it block by block, then you will have a well-designed, well-executed business model. But it all hinges on your ability to identify and execute those first couple of blocks correctly, right? So this section is about iterating, refining, and modifying your canvas as you learn. I call it the 3-layer process, so I visualize a layer cake when I talk about this stuff. Because when you start, you're at the bottom layer of the cake, which is you've got these ideas about who your customer is and what your value is, and even how much you want to charge for, or how much you think it's worth. Any one of those blocks on the model, you could put something there. But it's not been validated at all. It was just an idea, right? So that's layer 1 is, I've got some vision. It's important to have that vision and to document that vision. But then the next layer that you need to put on top of it is, how do I then take those possible visions and turn them into actual testable hypotheses where I can go out and validate, right? How do I actually put 2 different revenue models next to each other and get reactions to them to find out which one is the better one for the value of that particular customer? Which one does better match the value they see, right? And then the top layer is, now that I conduct the test, how do I actually package this into a cohesive model where the system is connected and it works, so that every single block directly connects to and makes sense with the block next to it, whether it's above it, below it, to its right, or to its left, right? And at the end, this is how you get the insight, right? Once you've got all these individual blocks with all this good, robust information, the insight comes from how they connect, right? And how you build the system of connection around those various models. And so by just doing this and testing, you're going to get much faster. Think about it simply. What you're basically executing is, I have these ideas. Does the idea pass or does it fail? And if it passes, you move it to the next layer or the next level. And if it fails, you either redesign it or you dump it and go to some other model altogether or some other customer segment altogether, because if you've done the upfront work, you didn't just have one audience to focus on. Maybe you got the right components, you just got the wrong audience, right? Now all that work that you've done doesn't go in the garbage, it's retained knowledge for whatever next step in the exploration you choose to go through. So every single thing you do is testable and usable. And failure is the biggest learning that you'll ever get in the world of creating ventures. Because anything you're willing to try and test it is more information faster than anybody who's afraid to try the risk to begin with. Because they'll still be thinking, I wonder what if? And you already know the answer, and you're 5 steps ahead of them because you were willing to try it and fail. This is the importance of prototyping. This is the importance of using the most simplistic prototyping you can come up with, the least expensive, the most archaic. It doesn't matter as long as it delivers the right information to the customer so that they're able to react and validate what you're thinking. If they see it as valuable, then you invest in building it out more for them, right? So I get with people all the time who are like, well, I have this idea, so I'm looking for somebody who will write the code for this app for me. I'll be like, no, you're not. You're not even close to being ready to spend the money to write and develop an app. That's the furthest thing from your mind right now. What you should be thinking about is, who can I get to stand behind a piece of cardboard that's cut to look like their phone and act out what I'm standing in front of it pushing to show what my app's going to do, so I can actually take it to somebody and show them the video and ask them if they're any interest whatsoever in it, if I think they're going to load it on their app screen and it's going to get any usage. Now that I can help you with, right? But I'm not going to find you somebody to code an app that you know nothing about. That's the craziest sunk cost in the world, right? That's the way we used to do things. But that was when there was all this market opportunity and there were all these things that people hadn't done before. Now almost everything is some iteration of something that came before it. And every space is competitive in some way. And there's so many substitutes. You just can't afford to do things that way and expect success. So prototype, prototype, prototype. I even have in this presentation, which I'll have Abina share with any attendees because I think she does attendance and can get a hold of you. But these are the test card and the learning card. And these are suggested by the website that supports the text that we use for our business models class here. So whether or not you saw them there, the key is, these are the things that I believe are going to happen, and in order to verify it, I'm going to run this test, and then I'm going to measure this, and if we're right, this is what I'm going to do, right? And then I take this one and I say, this is what I learned. What we believed was this, but what we actually observed was this, and as a result, we learned this, and now our next step is this, right? So you have the card that you think about what you want to test in each of those blocks of the business model. Then you have the card that gives you a documented way. Remember, it's all about collecting information and storing it in a uniform way because it makes it easier. It makes it easier and easier each time you go through it, and it makes all your results comparable as you move from audience to audience and segment to segment, and you can start to make your process so much more efficient just by being consistent in how you run your tests, right? Something this simple can help you be far more efficient. Then you can build that up to what I call some kind of report card format. So this is a scorecard that says these are all the hypotheses we had about our business model. Here's the test, the build, the measure, and the learn results that we have. So it's just a much more comprehensive way of looking at the process. And as the model evolves and you test different things, you just keep expanding the grid and building it out. This way, when you go to do customer segment 2 or 3, things that you learned back in customer segment 1 that are still relevant because of the similarities in this group, you won't repeat the mistake, right? Because you'll remember by reviewing this log what worked and what didn't work. Otherwise, you're going to forget if it's very complex, right? That's the danger that you run of not using good documentation. There are all kinds of systems out there. Again, this one comes from Strategizer. It's the website that supports the business models text. This is one that I found from a consulting firm that just shows a visual presentation of it that is about exploring the big idea and how you look at the 4 quadrants. So all different ways you could create, depending on what your concept is and what works for you, that you could track it. The important part is that you track it. And then lastly, you're to that decision, right? If you go through all these hypotheses, you do all this testing, you fill in all of the blocks of the business model, then at the end of the day, you're at the point where you should be able to clearly see if you have something here or if you don't, right? So for every stage, you're pivoting or proceeding, you know? Have you really identified that you know who your customers are? Have you found a true fit between the product or the service that you're designing and that customer market that you've identified? Do you know how to reach them? Can you comprehend that channel block? And then can you grow? Do you have a revenue model that's sustainable? Do you have your cost controlling measures in place? Do you know what that's going to look like and when and how you'll be able to make money, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're not bringing in enough revenue in some creative way to offset or do more than what it's costing you to create this value for people, this is how things don't get done. Because if the revenue can't support the value creation cost, then it's not deemed value worth creating, right? So it ends up being a fail in the market as a result. There are a couple of slides I put at the end that I'll share with you. For those of you who took the class, you may have remembered in the book, there's a thing about patterns. And what I want to say about that is that you can use them as inspiration because over the years, different people have looked at different successful models for business and they've identified that they tend to follow similar patterns, focusing on similar combinations of blocks, right, from the canvas. And so if you can be inspired by somebody's success in a pattern they used, sometimes coming up with a way to make a good or design a good business model is as simple as, let me pick an industry where that's needed, something similar that doesn't exist yet, and let me mimic the pattern that was used over here in this industry, and in doing so, you will naturally create something that has value among some subsegment of the marketplace. So this is another way, and more for ideation than actually testing your idea, to think about how you might want to structure a business model. You could go to patterns. There's some newer tools out there now that business models is sort of the way to think about business capture. I found this one from an Orange Hills consulting group where they actually call it the inspirator, right? How do I inspire business models? And they first take about, you can inspire it based on what you offer, based on how you create it, based on what customer you serve, or how you actually deliver it to the customers. And then they take you through what are some of the tactics that would be used to deliver that category of business model to a customer. And then they give you company examples that represent those different models. So it's similar to the concept of patterns. It's just presented in a much more colorful and robust way in this particular graph. This is what consultants do. This is what they do well, right? And so this will be in there as well too, just as food for thought. There's a lot of familiar companies and a lot of current companies as well as some good historical value to some of the examples they use. It's one of my favorite things about thinking through understanding how you want to be like or not like certain businesses that are out in the marketplace. And so from the inspiration perspective, that can be great. That's it. Are there questions? Questions? Any questions?
So I know you talked about the plasma TV and how the target audience wasn't like the mainstream audience. Do you know which audience they targeted like back then? Like why did they pay so much money for a plasma that wasn't like?
Because they wanted to be able to say, I got it first, right? And so in a tech business, which involves electronics and technology tools, the first audience is an easy audience because they're the people who want to be able to say, I had it first. Now the problem with it, what's that?
The Johnsons.
The Joneses or the Johnsons?
The Joneses.
The Joneses. So the idea is that not every industry or every market has an identifiable group that's what's that low-hanging fruit, as I want to be able to say I have it first. Every market to some degree has it, right? And I use this as an example to help illustrate it because we talked about the fact that you might not want to buy a car because you don't want to be spending all your time sitting in the mechanic shop. That's a pain, right? Yet there's some people who do it when it's in its first model, right? Well, then I flip it on students sometimes and I say, well, what about a pharmaceutical drug? Would you want to start taking a pill that nobody else had tried before and see whether or not it helped you if you're sick? The answer is no, unless, where do those early adopters come from? Terminal illness. Then if the alternative is that I don't survive, then yeah, I'll try it, right? And so every market, no matter how obscure it is, has a group of people somewhere that you can identify as a segment that is the person who wants to try it first for one reason or another, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a drug or if it's an electronic tool. There's a great book. People always think that I get paid by these publishers because I'm always pimping out all these things you should read. But if you've never read Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey Moore, that's exactly what that book is about. It's about the fact that you have meetings with people all the time who are so excited because they're like, I got 10% penetration in my target customer segment with my new idea for my entrepreneurship. You'll never get money that way because there's that many customers that are in the front end of that, I want to have it first, in almost every industry, every segment throughout history, which means you really haven't found anybody new and interesting that's really bought your idea yet. You just found a bunch of people who want to be able to say, I had it first. So that's not gotten you anywhere in terms of your idea development or proof, right? So you want to be really, really careful about making sure you know to what degree that front-end customer is accounting for your success or lack thereof in identifying a real bigger market opportunity, because they do exist in every single category you can think of. It's a good question. Any others? Yes?
Can you tell us, like, what are the ways to protect our ideas if something was good? But it's however it's good or bad, still, what are the major ways to protect our ideas?
Well, so I'm not an attorney, so I must caveat by saying I can give you no legal advice that you should take away from this, that you should hang your hat on. But there are standard mechanisms and standard qualifiers for what needs and or warrants protection. And they're actually governed specifically by where you want to sell the product, which means the protection, availability, and laws and circumstances are very different in the UK than they are here in the States. Those are both very different than they are in some other country, right? So you've got to know a bit about what your market presence and desire is to be to even know what you need to explore in that regard.
If it's in the US?
But in the US, you basically have some basic concepts that are protection oriented. You have trademarks, you have copyrights, and you have patents. And then you have trade secrets. All right? Those are the basic ways that you can go about making sure that on paper you are protected. But that's a very important thing that I say is on paper. Because anybody who's had me for an entrepreneurship class knows that I will be a very, 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 very diligent person reminding you that that doesn't stop somebody from infringing. All it does is give you your right to spend years in court and hundreds or thousands or millions of dollars defending it, right? So if you're not in a position to be able to do that, sometimes the investment in protection is not worth the payoff or the angst that you would have to go through on the back end, depending on what you're talking about, which is why you should always talk to an attorney, right? Because they're going to have a very good handle on what current trends are. Like, for example, sometimes the trend is judges will be issuing in favor of people who hold the protection a lot more at a specific period of time. Sometimes that tide will shift and they'll be issuing more in, if you can prove first use, you're more likely to win the case. You know, law works a lot on precedents that are set. And once somebody has a different ruling, it changes the precedent, then it can change the way things have been done legally in the courts. And so if you're not somebody who's been paying attention to that or keeping up with it, you could end up doing something that might have been good 5 years ago, but actually isn't really good to do right now, right? So I can tell you, you're limited in the number of things that you can choose from. So it's not a very complicated landscape in terms of the options you have for protection. But man, is it complicated in terms of the nuances within each of those options. And this is why I always say, always make best friends with somebody who's studying law early in your life. And stay in touch with them forever, so that while you're checking in on them and their dinner last night, you can pose a casual $750 an hour question and get a free response. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. Right? Accountants too, those tax laws, same thing. Right? Constantly changing. So I can't say enough, I always tout, I'm joking a bit, but I always tout the importance of the network, right? But the network is usually the most valuable when it's unlike you. You have your own expertise you're earning by studying and working and getting experience in a particular area. What about the things that you don't care enough to become an expert in? Who's going to help you with those? Because all of them are involved somewhere on that canvas, right? That's where I think you need to think about networking and what your network looks like differently than the average person thinks about it. In my class, I always say, when you meet somebody interesting at a party, you go back and you usually find them and follow them on a social tool because you met them at a party. But if one of the things you found interesting about them was something that they told you about this thing that they were working on, and you were like, wow, I never thought of that, that's so cool, where you really should be going to connect with them is LinkedIn. Because if they keep moving on, you'll be connected to them professionally, not socially, and it will be much easier for you to introduce a professional question or a professional conversation with that person if you want them to truly be somebody who's beneficial to you in a professional context. Just because you met them at a party doesn't mean you have to friend them on Instagram or Facebook or whatever you do. I don't use any of that stuff, right? So that's my point, right? You've got to think about the network and how you build the network and how you leverage the connections over time. Yes?
You suggest some essential books during the business.
Well, there's a few things I would tell you. So on the topic of business models, of course, anything that's in the framework, which is both the business model generation book that we use as a text for our course here, and also the value proposition canvas book, those are authored by over 300 to 400 experts in the industry. It's a collaborative text publishing initiative. So it was an innovative business model in that to get a book published, typically you had to write a whole manuscript and go shop it around and get somebody to buy into your idea. This guy, Alex Osterwalder, had this idea. All these people who are expert in their field would love to be able to say, I helped write a book. And they would love to put that on their CV and their resume. And in fact, some of them liked it enough that guess what they did? They gave him money in order to be included on the list of authors in that book. And before you know it, he had enough money to self-publish the first publication of Business Model Generation. And he had a built-in marketing tool because with 380 people saying my book's coming out today, all over their digital networks, and people who have moms and cousins and sisters and brothers and sisters who wanted to show support, guess what happened to the first edition? Sold right out. Didn't have to do any work. Had 5 publishers competing for that book, for rights to publish it as soon as its first edition sold out, self-published. Did no work. Has done no work since then. It was all about thinking about the value proposition to who you needed in order to make the idea succeed, and then selling that proposition to the right people in order to generate success in the model, right? So those are 2 great books. If you have not read Steve Blank's books, you should. He has one called The Path to the Epiphany that is absolutely essential, and hopefully, if I did my job today, should in some way fully support pretty much everything I told you today. Because I really believe that when it comes to talking about how to build something from nothing, he's one of the best, right?
Thanks.
Steve Blank, yes. And then there is a book, if you're interested in out-of-the-box thinking about this concept, called The Freaks and Weirdos Shall Inherit the Earth. Fantastic book. Fantastic book about unique venture creation and entrepreneurial thinking. Those are the top of mind ones that come to my head when I think. And they all include some type of reference to business models and business model development, because they all understand that those essential blocks create success in any context.
I am developing my business model for the top brand competition. May I meet with you to talk to you about it?
You can't. So the reason I put my info here is because it's got my phone number here, and my office is in Gibbs Hall, and my email's here. So if you want to meet one-on-one with me to get some advice or some mentorship on any idea that you're exploring or anything that you're tossing around and just don't know what to do with it next, I'm more than happy to do that, right? I choose to spend my time here versus other things that I could do professionally because the enjoyment, the value that I get is helping see other people succeed. So anything I can do to support that is what I prioritize while I'm here. It's why my publishing schedule is way behind, but I have students who are very happy that I take meetings with them at all hours of the day, because that's my priority. It's my personal priority. Anything else? Thank you so much for your attention. Hope you got something from it. Let me know if you need me in the future.